Okay, I think we're ready to go, right, Colby? Well, good morning. My name is John Gastright. I'm the president of the Project 2049 Institute, and welcome to this 10th edition of our Strategic Competition webinar series. Today, we're especially fortunate to have as our special guest the Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Congressman Rob Wittman. Congressman Wittman has represented Virginia's 1st congressional district since 2007, hard to believe. Mr. Wittman is a leader in the Congress on the vital significance of American sea power to maintain stability and security around the world, the importance of transitioning innovative commercial technologies to the U.S. Department of Defense, deepening our relationship with India, demanding that the Chinese Communist Party come clean once and for all on the origins of COVID-19, just to name a few hot issues. I'm really looking forward to a great conversation. Congressman Wittman will also be joined later by Yuki Tatsumi, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and co-director of their East Asia program and director of their Japan program. Before we get started, though, I've got a couple of administrative announcements to help you have the best opportunity to participate today. And here they are. There are 2 ways to participate in today's live Q&A session. Number 1, you can send questions directly to ask@project2049.net. That's ask@project2049.net. If you RSVP'd for the event, we sent an event reminder from that email just moments ago, and you can respond directly to that email with your questions if you'd like. If you have a YouTube account and are watching this stream on Project 2049's YouTube channel, you can submit questions in the YouTube chat box, and our team will collect them and send them to our moderator, Jin Hong. So please include your name and affiliation when submitting those questions. The questions with names and affiliations get prioritized. With that, it's time to get started. And to kick things off, I have the pleasure of introducing our boss, the chairman of the Project 2049 Institute, the Honorable Randy Schriver. Randy?
John, thank you very much. And Congressman Wittman, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure. I had an opportunity to meet you recently in a different capacity when I was representing the U.S. China Security Economic Review Commission, and we briefed out our annual report to you. But I've got to say, I think we learned more from you than you probably learned from us. Your expertise is really extraordinary in these areas. So was really looking forward to this conversation. So thanks again for joining us. If I could just start with a recent news announcement. We saw the lineup on the new China Select Committee, and it looks as though you will be the senior member there and supporting Chairman Gallagher. Would you mind sharing with us your vision for this Select Committee and what you believe the agenda will be going forward?
Absolutely, Randy. Well, as you know, select committees don't have any statutory power to pass legislation. So our job is going to be to investigate all the different subject matter areas related to China, both strategically, economically, and what China is doing and how it affects the United States. And I believe that we'll have the opportunity to draft legislation and then send that on to the other committees of jurisdiction. So I'm anxious to be an integral part of that committee. We actually met last night to go through some of the thoughts, ideas, and objectives of what we want to do. It's going to be a very intense effort to make sure we get at all the issues surrounding China. I believe that China is the strategic threat of not only this age, but of ages to come. If you look at where we are today and the potential impact of China going forward, it is significant. I would argue historically one of the largest challenges that the United States has faced since its birth back in the late 1700s. This is really the challenge of our lifetime. And we laid out yesterday a number of the areas that we're going to be looking at, not just from the military standpoint, but from the economic standpoint, from the supply chain standpoint. There are a lot of different elements of that, from coronavirus to other things that China does. Also activities here in the United States. I can go down the list of things that they are involved with here that are nefarious efforts to try to undermine the elements of our republic that operates within a democracy, and understanding too that in a free and open society we have certain things that we do just as a matter of our Constitution, And the Chinese are very adept at trying to take advantage of that. I would argue, though, that ultimately our system of government prevails, but it is going to take a significant amount of effort. And what we want to do is to point those things out and look at what we can do in all aspects of protecting this nation strategically from this both overt and covert operations by the Chinese to weaken the United States and ultimately China to dominate the world.
Well, thank you for that. That's an excellent preview and certainly an ambitious agenda, but a very important one. You mentioned possibly working on legislation and passing it to the committees of jurisdiction. In some cases, you might be passing that right to yourself as a senior member of the Armed Services Committee and the work you're doing on sea power. On the military piece, what do you see as the priorities for the new Congress, very much informed by what you're studying on the Select Committee related to China's military modernization, their ambitions in the region? Are there certain aspects that you're looking forward to working on in the new Congress?
Well, I am. I'm very interested in looking at where China is developing their new technology, also what they're doing in essentially stealing our technology, what they're doing too in coercing American companies to hand over technology. We know intellectual property transfer there is rampant in any company that wants to do business there. Also, looking at how technology sometimes gets subverted and transferred to China, bypassing the ITAR regulations. I think all those things are things that we have to look at. The most important element, Randy, of what I see the United States has to do is look at opportunities to be able to move ahead of the Chinese. And listen, there's some exciting areas there. I think in areas like 5G technology, where we've finally been able to say, no, we're not going to allow Huawei hardware to be put in place here. There's incredible advancements in 5G technology taking place here. That's one place where we can step ahead. What's happening too in space to be able to not only catch up, but to move ahead of the Chinese in all orbitals for constellations, both low Earth orbit satellites, mid Earth orbit, and geo orbits, I think are all going to be incredibly important and a great opportunity going forward. Another thing too is looking at how we operate from a different perspective. You know, it's always been about looking at big programs, large platforms. I think we have to be able to diversify, look not only at unmanned systems, but looking at ways that we can complicate the risk calculus for the Chinese. And also looking at how do we do that within a finite economic space. Listen, we're not going to see the massive increases in the defense budget that we've seen the last couple of years. That's just a reality of what we're going to have to deal with. So the question is, you know, how do we do things like make $858 billion operate like $1 trillion? I mean, I think we can do those things, and the Pentagon is going to have to be part of that. We're going to have to look at doing things more efficiently. The way that we succeed strategically is to make sure that we get more per our dollar than the Chinese get per their yuan. We can do that. We have done that in the past. We have to continue to do that. Two other things, Randy, that are incredibly important going forward. The United States cannot do this all by themselves. We do not have by ourselves the wherewithal to counter China and the things that they're doing and spreading their tentacles into other areas and things like relationships with Russia. We have to develop even stronger partnerships with nations around the world, but most importantly in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad agreement, I think, holds a lot of promise. The same with the AUKUS agreement. We also have to make sure too that we are leveraging private capital in the United States. There are a number of individuals that want to invest in emerging technologies that have direct applications to deterring China, to providing a strategic overmatch against China. We need to leverage those private dollars. We need to do things to make it easier for startups and emerging technologies to be applied within the defense world. So those are things that I'm going to be focused on. Those are things I'm going to be very excited about working on and advancing. And I believe putting the United States in a strategically advantageous position in this competition with China.
Well, thank you for that answer. A couple of follow-ups. You put a lot on the table there. I'm encouraged by your commentary on what some people refer to as the run faster side of this, continuing to out innovate and keep the technological edge. That's absolutely critical, and that is a way, I think, to get more capability per dollar. But in some instances in the Indo-Pacific, quantities do have a quality all of their own, given the tyranny of time and distance and the vastness of that ocean. And you've talked a lot in the past about naval shipbuilding in the United States, and that's a place where we start at a quantitative disadvantage. How do you see the future of our surface fleet and that sort of asymmetry that we're living with? How does that figure into being appropriately postured for this challenge, in your opinion?
Well, we have to have Navy Marine Corps presence in the Indo-Pacific. That's the only way that we're going to deter the Chinese. Listen, our other service branches too have a role to play there. The Army in being able to provide long-range precision fires in that theater, to the Air Force having extended range to be able to provide opportunities to not only defend but also to put at risk Chinese assets in that particular area. So all those elements are part of that teamwork. But the most important element of that, in my mind, is indeed that naval presence there. And we have to be able to modernize our fleets. We have to make sure we're using the existing platforms to the maximum extent possible. We can't be retiring those platforms early because we just don't have the size Navy to be able to do the things necessary in the Indo-PACOM if we do things like what was proposed last year. The president's budget proposed last year, building 8 ships, one of those an ocean-going tug, so I would argue 7 warships, and retiring 26 ships. I mean, the math just doesn't work. I'm sorry, it should be 24 ships. So anyway, the element of what we're looking at there, the math just doesn't add up. So what we were able to do is to close the gap, is to build more ships. We ended up building, or putting in the budget, building 11 ships and retiring 12. So still not on the plus side, but still, I think, a vast improvement. What we're going to be focusing on this year is indeed building more ships than those that we are retiring. And I understand some of the elements that happen with platforms when they age, but they are still incredibly capable platforms. And what we have to be able to do too is to look at the proper naval architectures. You've said, what types of ships do we have? How do we have the full complement of ships, from carrier strike groups to our cruisers? And cruisers still have a utility, to our Arleigh Burke class destroyers, to the new Constellation class of frigates, to LCS. Listen, LCS still has some utility. I think one of the areas we need to really be focused on, that I started down the road on last year in the NDAA, and that is, as we are retiring some of these LCS ships, some of them early, a great opportunity for us to do foreign military sales to our friends in the Indo-PACOM, to countries like the Philippines, where we can actually sell those ships to the Philippines, who have miles and miles of shoreline to patrol, and help them to at least have presence there in countering the Chinese. Those things are force multipliers for us, and they also provide opportunities for the Philippine Navy to train jointly and operate jointly with the United States Navy, all things that we've done in the past but have not done as much of recently. I think also it opens up an opportunity for countries like Vietnam that want to do more things with the United States, both economically and strategically. So we have to look at different ways to utilize the assets that we have. And even though it may not be directly in the U.S. inventory, I think there are opportunities there to really expand that. And it's all based around building a Navy of the future. Remember, the United States Code says 355 ships. So that's where we need to be. And it's still an arduous path to get there. And it's going to be a challenge. We look at where we have superiority right now, which is under the sea. Our attack submarine fleet is going to drop from a current 50 down to 46 by 2028, well short of the 66 boat requirement. And on top of that, making sure we're working with the Australians so that they can build a nuclear power submarine for their fleet, which will help the United States in the Indo-PACOM area of operations, to make sure we have the capability necessary there. That in and of itself is going to require greater capacity in the shipbuilding realm to make those things happen. Those things are on track. We put $768 million additional dollars in last year's NDAA for building the submarine industrial base. So it's not only going to be about building subs for the United States, but also getting the Australians on track so that they can have a nuclear powered submarine as a transition from the Collins class submarine that they have. And there's still going to be a gap there. So we also have to answer the question, how do we help them fill that gap? All significantly difficult questions that we have to answer. But again, relying on our allies there, and I cannot overemphasize agreements like the Quad, where we have Japan, and Japan deserves kudos from the United States. They have done an extraordinary amount to really answer the call on what's necessary to deter China. Their efforts have been incredible. The same with what's developing with India. So the Quad agreement, which is United States, Australia, India, and Japan, are going to be one of those critical elements in what we do to deter the Chinese in that region. We know that it cannot be the United States by itself, but the United States, I think, is in a position to leverage its resources along with its allies in the region to really create the countermeasure to China that's necessary to assuage them from any sort of additional aggressive behavior in the region.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I think Dr. Tatsumi may have more to say about this, but you mentioned our great ally, Japan, and the fact that they're taking some significant steps. Prime Minister Kishida's recent visit, where he was able to talk to President Biden about the new national security strategy there, the increase in defense spending, the introduction of counterstrike. Could you say a little more about Japan's importance, particularly as they take these steps into really uncharted territory, at least post-World War II capabilities and outlook? Your thoughts on the U.S. Japan alliance?
Absolutely. Well, listen, Japan has been leading the way in the region to really communicate the threat from China and then match that assessment of the threat with their efforts to expand capability and capacity in the region to make sure that they're deterring that threat. And they've been an exceptional partner with the United States, and for that matter, other countries in the ASEAN consortium, and making sure that they're doing everything they can to counter the Chinese. And it's required a significant change in how Japan operates. Obviously, for years, there had been some constitutional limitations on what Japan could do. To Japan's credit, they put in place changes so that they can statutorily pursue these enhanced operational capacity and capability opportunities and do more in the region. I think they clearly understand how the Chinese threat is growing. They see the increased Chinese aggressive behavior in the region and know that they have to be part of this effort in order to deter the Chinese. And to their credit, in every realm, they are making the commitment to do that, which is important, because when China sees that increased effort and that increased commitment from Japan, from the United States, from Australia, from the UK, from India, that is a great way to counter what China is doing in the region too, with them trying to, many times through opportunistic or transactional or even aggressive means, to co-opt other nations in the area to be friendly or to be helpful to China. We know the way that we counter that is to make sure we have strong relationships with others in the region. Japan's at the very top of the list of realizing how powerful that is and what they can do to enhance not only what they do to deter in the region, but also their relationships with other countries in the region. And they've been very helpful with the United States to have conversations with other nations there. They're being courted by the Chinese to make sure that they understand what they can do in relation to the relationships with their countries and Japan, as well as the United States, Australia, and others in the region. So they've been a great counter to what China's doing in the region to try to expand their reach in the region. Japan has done a great job in countering that with their conversations with other nations in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. Project 2049 just returned from a delegation visit to Taiwan, not a treaty ally in a formal sense, but really at the center of all of this right now, given the urgency of the threat that Taiwan faces. We had great discussions, including over an hour with President Tsai. She had just announced a day or two before that they were extending the length of conscription service back up to a year. So a lot happening there. The Congress has been active as well. Last NDAA included some provisions to try to strengthen security assistance, maybe even through the use of FMF. But there's still questions that you hear in Washington about, is there enough urgency? Are they doing enough fast enough given the threat? Are they investing in the right things? Should we be more forward leaning in terms of our commitment? President Biden has been clear himself, but sometimes that gets walked back by the administration and they cling to this ambiguity. So I'd just be interested in your general thoughts on how we're doing as a partner to Taiwan, how you think they're doing at addressing the threat, and your level of confidence that we can keep holding deterrence in that critical area.
Well, I think we've taken a good first step in this past year's NDAA, but I do think that we need to do more. And the blueprint is what we did to help Ukraine after the first Russian incursion with the Wagner Group to go in there and essentially install their own Moscow's friendly government. And then the people of Ukraine said no. We had an opportunity then to train and equip Ukrainian troops, and we see the outcome of that. The same needs to be put in place with Taiwan. I think there's an incredible amount of opportunity there. I know I've spoken with our National Guard commander in Virginia, our Adjutant General, Major General Tim Williams, about what the Virginia National Guard does in joint training operations with Taiwan. More of those opportunities need to take place, as well as helping Taiwan modernize their military to make sure, too, that they have the necessary capability that can be fielded quickly to deter the Chinese. You know, it takes years to build ships and to do those things, but it doesn't take long to have a very robust supply of mines to be able to mine the Taiwanese straits if there is aggression that breaks out, to where you can deter the Chinese from coming across there and invading Taiwan. The same, too, with having a land force that can make it incredibly difficult for the Chinese to pursue an amphibious landing to be able to go to Taipei and take Taipei. So there are a lot of things that can be done that need to take the additional steps. So I think we've taken a good first step. There have been, I think, very good conversations with Taiwan and what needs to happen strategically. But I think we have a great blueprint in what we've done to help Ukraine, and seeing the outcome that that's had and what they've been able to do to counter the Russians. I think we can do the same thing with Taiwan. The key is can we do it fast enough? As the old song goes, we have a long ways to go and a short time to get there. And I believe that's indeed the situation. I think this year you'll see much more happening in the NDAA, and it'll be a point of discussion, too, for the Select Committee on China.
Great. Well, thank you. You know, you started your first comments by saying we haven't seen a threat like this maybe since the beginning of our republic. And I immediately thought, well, the White House was burned in 1812, and I went through these scenarios in my mind. But when you think about it, the devastation of COVID, the devastation of fentanyl, these are all originating from China, and the Chinese are less than helpful in helping us deal with this. So, you know, as I thought through that, I think you've definitely identified the nature of this strategic challenge. But you look at COVID, you look at fentanyl, you look at Chinese influence in American institutions like academia. How do we get our hands around the domestic challenges here in the United States that China is posing, which I would argue is every bit as threatening as somebody trying to burn the White House in 1812?
I would agree, Randy. The efforts of where we see fentanyl flowing across the border, most all of it originating from China, the outcome of COVID originating in China, the things that we see happening in our academic institutions with the rise in the very aggressive efforts by Confucius Institutes, the efforts by Chinese entities to buy U.S. agricultural lands. You can go down the list of things that are happening within the United States, and as well as those things that are happening through sources in digital media that seek to move public opinion, to be able to create certain dialogues in ways that obviously create challenges for the United States. I think all of those things we have to look at in summation to determine how do we best counter those. And again, we operate under our structure of a republic under our Constitution as a free and open society. The Chinese take full advantage of that. And listen, there's nothing that we should do in any way, shape, or form to impinge upon our freedoms and liberties. But what we do have to do is to be very mindful of the insidious behavior of China and look for ways to be able to counter that. And those are going to take some pretty vigorous debate. A great example would be the purchase of farmland. You know, I'm always reticent for the government to get involved in interacting in how the sale of real estate should take place. But I do think there's probably a place to have a discussion to say, okay, with certain entities, you're going to be prohibited from purchasing properties, whether it's agricultural lands, or we see the Chinese too purchasing strategic blocks of property around our very secure military and testing installations. All those things, again, very insidious efforts to be able to gather intelligence and to gain an advantage strategically against the United States. So I do think we're going to have to get into the realm of saying, no, we're going to prohibit these sorts of sales of any of these assets in these areas because we believe that they are a threat to our national security. So we're going to have to think differently. We're going to have to be able to also act quickly. You know, it's not just in the realm of land transfers. It's also what's happening in financial markets. Again, the Chinese are using to their advantage how certain investment vehicles are being used. And it's amazing to me how many of these investment entities today are using ESG, environmental, social, and governmental determiners in how they make investments. And many of those investments are going to firms in China, some of the biggest human rights abusers on the face of the earth, which are completely counter to ESG goals, yet massive amounts of investment are taking place there. And it's not only what's happening in our exchanges, where over 1,000 companies are being traded there, but also it's what's happening in those off-market areas, those exchange-traded funds, those A-shares, and also bonds that are being sold by China that send money directly to the CCP. All those things have to be addressed, and there's some of the subject areas that we brought up yesterday and what we're going to be addressing in this select committee on China. I'm going to be sitting down with a number of members of the Financial Services Committee, folks like Andy Barr and Blaine Lukenmeyer, that have dealt with this and looked for ways for us to be able to get into those realms. So that's kind of a scope. You know, we all kind of think about the hard power issues that we have to deal with, and they're real. But some of the more insidious efforts by China are not the ones that make the headlines, but the ones that actually are feeding the beast that potentially can consume us.
I really appreciate you raising those issues. At our institute, we have an initiative to look at the economic aspects of strategic competition with China. Our theory of the case being, in many ways, these are sort of the laggard areas. Our economic agencies for decades have been of the mindset to get American business into China, create joint ventures, create opportunity, and now we're sort of asking them to reverse course. But a lot of those issues you mentioned are going to be extremely challenging, and we're a nonpartisan institute, but if I could just for a moment say, but for Republicans to really be in the lead and saying, you're not going to be able to invest capital where you would otherwise want to invest it. You're not going to be able to sell property in the United States where you otherwise might be able to sell it. So how do you have that conversation with the American people and really persuade people that there may be some costs, there may be some temporary restrictions on things they might otherwise want to do in the economic space? How do we carry this conversation effectively to the American people to be able to really implement this agenda?
Well, Randy, I think there's an emerging understanding with the American public about the extent and magnitude of the threat that China poses to the United States. And I think, as we've seen in past times in history, I think the American public is very willing to make sacrifices if they know what the sacrifices are for. You know, if you're asking them to do things and they don't see a utility to it, it's very difficult to convince them. But I do think that there's an emerging understanding with people to say it's not a good thing for the Chinese to be buying up massive amounts of farmland. It's not a good thing for the Chinese to be buying up strategically important properties around our military institutions. It's not a good thing for what's happening in financial markets to send money to China only for that to be used against us. It's not a good thing for companies to hand over their intellectual property 3, 4, 5 years later, find that Chinese companies have actually copied what they're doing and are now marketing the same things that U.S. companies are doing. So I think people are seeing that for what it is. And we talked about it last night. There will be a cost, and people are going to have to understand that this is not going to be without some sacrifice across a number of different areas. And what we have to be able to do is to communicate the true magnitude of the threat, what the consequences are if we don't act, and then how taking some upfront costs now will save us many dollars and the actual future of our nation in years to come.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. I think my colleague's going to join in a moment and open this discussion up a little bit. So let me take my opportunity for a last question here. You know, sometimes when we talk about the China challenge, you necessarily focus on all their various lines of effort to harm us, weaken our posture, et cetera, and you come away thinking, boy, this is not only a tough challenge, we're really up against it. But let me ask you, are you optimistic in this strategic competition as it unfolds? Do you believe that we have what we need to prevail if we have the focus and attention of senior leaders? What's your level of optimism on this great challenge?
Listen, I think we have the full capacity and capability, Randy, to counter this challenge and to prevail in this challenge. But let's not underestimate the magnitude of the challenge. It is significant. It is one of the largest challenges this nation has faced in its history. So it will take a unity in effort, a unity in direction, a unity in policy to make sure that we achieve these things. I think we have that full opportunity in front of us. I think it's going to take an incredible effort, and I think that we can do it. But let's not underestimate the challenge in front of us, and let's not underestimate what it will take to be able to counter the Chinese, because they've been at this for a long, long period of time. In fact, I would argue from 9/11 until just about 5 years ago, there was a complacency in addressing what was happening on the strategic and economic side in China, as it was now working to place itself in a dominant position against the rest of the world. And where I think you saw a turning point was in the United States. It's been about 5 or so years ago where the mindset started to change. The mindset went from, oh, we can engage China, we can be in their markets, we can get them to be a partner with us, and they'll be benign in how they deal with us. And we saw that that was not indeed the case. The same realization came to folks in Australia who looked at it and said, we're going to try to be friends with China. We think that they can be a partner with us. And then what they saw is, leading up to COVID and through COVID, that indeed China was not a friend, was indeed aggressive, was not working in the interest of anybody in that region, were working in their own self-interest. So I think a realization is set in with folks around the world to see China for what it is. So I think that realization is the first step of where we have to be in order to make the commitment, which will be significant, in order to deter China. And it will take an effort along the lines of what we've seen in other major times in world history, where we've had aggressive regimes that have done things that have been detrimental to the United States, from the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany to other elements of what's happened in world history. I think those things should inform what all of us need to do when we see these instances coming up before us. And I think that also, can set in motion the necessary efforts among nations around the world to say, if we sit aside or stand aside and not act, then we know what the outcome will be. The good news is that I think nations across the spectrum, from the United States, and listen, Japan has done the same thing as Australia. They have acknowledged the threat that China poses and have said, we're not just going to identify the threat, we're going to act to counter the threat. So it's good to see those nations that are standing up and saying we have to act in order to counter that, because we see the true magnitude of the impact that China can have on what happens around the world. And China has one objective and one objective only, and that is to dominate the world and to hold everybody else in the world subservient, and to do it under their form of government, which The other countries that are friends like Japan and Australia and India and others say, no, that's not how we want to see the world operate. That's not how we believe our country should operate. I think that's the overwhelming force of good that will help us overcome this issue. And remember, I always tell folks, this is pretty simple contrast here. The United States, Japan, India, Australia, our friends and allies around the world, the UK and others, we are the good guys and China are the bad guys. Pretty clear contrast.
Thank you. Yeah, sometimes putting it in those simple terms is very helpful because we need to have that foundation, I think, to have confidence in ourselves and in our allies and be postured to prevail in this competition. So thank you for reminding us of that. I'm going to invite my colleague, Jen Hong, into the conversation, and I think we'll have some comments from Yuki. But Jen, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman Schriver. Thank you all for joining. My name is Jennifer Hong. I'm the Senior Director with Project 2049. If you are joining us now, you just missed an amazing conversation between Congressman Wittman and Chairman Schriver on just the understanding the extent, the magnitude, and the consequences of the threat of the CCP that CCP poses to the United States and to the region, the importance of cooperation with our allies, celebrating the work that's been done through AUKUS and the Quad, and just additional steps that we can take in Taiwan to deter China, which Congress Wittman said is the strategic threat of today and ages to come. So we need to think differently and quickly. This fascinating discussion will be available on our YouTube channel and webpage. So do come and tune in after this conversation, share with your friends. We're now going to turn it over to transition. We're going to transition to the panel portion of our webinar, where we will invite Ms. Yuki Tatsumi, who is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center. Before joining Stimson, Ms. Tatsumi worked as a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and as a special assistant for political affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. In addition, she is a recipient of the 2009 Yasuhiro Nakasone Incentive Award, and in 2012 was awarded the Letter of Appreciation from the Ministry of National Policy of Japan for her contribution in advancing mutual understanding between the United States and Japan. So for this section, we're going to ask Ms. Tatsumi to start us off with her thoughts and assessments of what she's heard, also the threat picture of the United States and allies in the 2023. How well are we prepared to navigate these challenges? We are still accepting questions. So before we transition to the live Q&A, we ask that you send us questions at ask@project2049.net or submit questions on YouTube channel if you're joining us live. Well, Ms. Tatsumi, over to you. Please share your thoughts with us.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for that kind introduction. And it's truly an honor to participate in this conversation. And I'm still actually trying to digest this deep conversation that Randy and Congressman Wittman had over the spanning everything from a U.S. Japan alliance, the China threat assessment, to a future of the U.S. naval sea power. So it was a truly like interesting and thought-provoking, and I really learned a lot from it. So I really don't have too much to add to what Congressman Wittman had already laid out, but if I can add a few points and perhaps ask Randy and Congressman Wittman maybe a question each to you, that will be fantastic. So as a Congressman Wittman alluded to, Japan is really coming into a kind of a, I would call it like a moment of true awakening, where Japan has actually faced Chinese pressing threat for the last decade. They did have a watershed incident where Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese fishermen rammed into a Japan Coast Guard ship over the in the East China Sea area, and when Japan took a very firm stance against it, tried to prosecute the captain of the fishermen, China really unleashed or rolled out its economic coercion diplomacy, where try to limit the export of rare earth and other critical metals that Japan has had, and that really gave many people in Japan who always was thought that we can engage China, and they will come to become a more positive force in international order. That really was the incident where that raised a question in minds of many Japanese. And fast forward to today, we already we already heard a little bit about Prime Minister Kishida's visit, but what was even more far-reaching was the 2+2 ministerial that happened 2 days before that leaders summit. And that is really where U.S. and Japan, both foreign policy and defense establishment, really rolled out the joint vision for the future and for the next decade of how two countries and two countries national security establishment are really aligning their threat perception, how we're going to run faster and think quicker together, and especially based on the this really ambitious and visionary plan that Japan rolled out for itself, for its national security strategy and defense strategy, and then also defense buildup. Japan, for the first time, as Randy alluded to, declared that it will introduce counter-strike capabilities and also really begin to invest in some of the critical technologies. And they're particularly interested in unmanned, given the aging population and they're foreseeing the challenge in the manpower. So they are really started really thinking seriously about what is the best mix of unmanned and a manned platform, and how they will not just work together within Japanese systems, but then also first and foremost be able to work that seamlessly with the U.S. So this is what brings me to my questions. So to Congressman Wittman, I really heard it with a great interest about your concern about the future of a U.S. naval shipbuilding and naval surface fleet and so forth. Japan really has a similar problem, but then also, as you know, U.S. and Japan Navy-to-Navy relations have this seven decades deep relationship, where Seventh Fleet is home ported to Japan, and then also 3MEF has been headquartered in Japan, and Japan has been the proud host of those headquarters. And I think moving forward with this very ambitious plan that Japan has for itself, for the defense industry's revamping of it, it really defense industrial base between the two countries can really work together as a force multiplier. You already mentioned AUKUS. But how do you see, especially that you have so much of your forward deployed forces deployed in the Indo-Pacific region, and obviously geographically, Japan can solve a lot of those tyranny of distance issues for the U.S. forces that are forward deployed. So I just wanted to tap into your thought on how you could envision this industrial partnership between, not just between U.S. Japan, but then you already mentioned Quad, AUKUS, so basically the coalition of allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific.
Well,
And for Randy, very quickly, I really followed the last year Taiwan Policy Act that was introduced in the Senate with a great interest. Many of the key element of that is incorporated into NDAA already. But now that the Republican has the majority in the House also, that how do you see the how do either of you see the similar version of the policy maybe introduced, being discussed in the House side as well?
Well, Yuki, I'll start. The relationship between the Japanese Navy and the United States Navy has never been stronger. Going to Yokosuka, you can see that. You can see the capability there to sustain U.S. naval operations in that area of the Indo-Pacific, as well as what the Japanese are doing in building and maintaining their Navy. An important change that I believe that happened a number of years ago, as you know, is the strategic relationship between the navies. As you know, for years, there was a limitation that the Japanese Navy could not, in instance of a conflict, if they were operating jointly with the United States. If a United States ship was shot at, the Japanese couldn't essentially help defend that ship. As you know, that relationship has now changed, where the policy now is you're operating jointly. If either of the country's ships are shot at, both will come to the defense of the other. That was a big change, and it allows a very different way for our navies to operate. The other element of what I think is incredibly important, and that is the sharing of technology. And while the United States has always been very limiting in how it shares technology, I think we have to look much more forward about how the provisions in ITAR, which is how we look at the sharing of technology, especially military technology with other, goes forward. And how do we make sure that we provide enhanced opportunities for our close friends to be able to build capability in their fleets that are complementary to the United States. As the Japanese look to modernize their Navy, just as we are, we all understand we cannot do it by ourselves. The true factor that leverages what both countries have is the ability to sustain our fleets, but also to operate together. So the more things we do to build complementary capacity, to make sure that our ships can operate in joint ways to an even greater extent, whether it's weapon systems or communications. And, you know, if for years it's always been that they're kind of two different systems. They can do a few things together, but you can't leverage jointly the capability in both navies to the extent that you should be able to. So I think that holds great potential for both countries to be able to leverage that element of operation there. And with the investment that China's making in modernizing their Navy, as well as what the United States is doing, that to me is going to be one of those force multipliers that's incredibly important going forward. And I think that's one of the discussions that's taking place right now between the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy, as well as between the Biden administration and Prime Minister Kishida's administration. I think those things are critical to get it to the policy level between the leadership in both countries, but then get it also down to the discussions between the navies.
Well, Yuki, thanks for the question. I think probably Congressman Wittman could probably talk more authoritatively about what might be coming in the new Congress. But let me just tell you some perspectives from our recent trip to Taiwan. You know, President Tsai and her cabinet were very grateful for the support of the Congress and very grateful for the various elements of the NDAA that were meant to strengthen Taiwan's defense. But a couple of additional thoughts. You know, we're very focused on the invasion threat for understandable reasons, but President Tsai pointed out we're facing threats every day. We're facing coercion and intimidation every day. And she refers to it as cognitive warfare. They're really trying to undermine Taiwan's confidence. They're trying to present the eventual unification as almost a near fait accompli, that it's inevitable. So we need to think also about counter-coercion scenarios and helping Taiwan deal with the day-to-day threats they're facing, not just the invasion threat, which of course is important. So maybe there's some work for Congress to do there. The second thing is they're studying the Ukraine situation very carefully. They're trying to harvest the right lessons learned. And certainly one of them is that after the invasion, the very courageous President Zelensky, not only did he not look for a ride out of Kiev, he stayed, but he also was able to communicate with the people of Ukraine and the international community and really be able to demonstrate continuity of government and confidence. Taiwan is an island and very vulnerable. They could be cut off from communications and contact with the rest of the world. So Taiwan is very interested in their own continuity of government challenge and communications challenge. How can we as a partner help them develop those capabilities so if that terrible day should come, President Tsai or a successor of hers can do the same kind of thing as Zelensky, rally the country, talk to the international community about their needs, and so on and so forth. So maybe these are some things that the Congress would be able to look at, but certainly would have full confidence in Congressman Wittman and his colleagues to take this up in the new Congress.
Thank you so much. We have just 10 minutes left on this webinar, and we have so many questions coming in from the audience. So we are going to transition to our live Q&A. first question, actually, we're going to combine the first question. And these questions are from Joseph Bosco, who's former China Country Desk Officer in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and Russell Shao from the Global Taiwan Institute. For Congressman Wittman, regarding your point on affecting China's risk analysis and deterring it from military adventurism, could you share your thinking on the need to end America's policy of strategic ambiguity on defending Taiwan? And to what extent will Taiwan be a focus of the Select Committee? And if so, what are its priorities?
Well, Taiwan will absolutely be a focus of the Select Committee on China. In fact, the Chairman Gallagher, would like for us to hold a hearing in Taiwan, which I think that we will do. I think that'll be incredibly meaningful to the world as well as Taiwan. The issue too of whether strategic ambiguity is the right posture for the United States to take, I think at this particular point, being very direct with China as to the outcome of their efforts to reunify with Taiwan needs to be very, very direct. And strategic ambiguity doesn't do that. And to somehow think that pursuing strategic ambiguity is not going to be provocative or is going to some way cease the aggressive behavior by China, I think is just a misnomer. I mean, you see how belligerent and aggressive Xi Jinping is and the CCP in China. And let me emphasize too, you know, we use the term China in the broad perspective, but I want to make sure that people understand that the efforts that we see from China are the CCP. It is President Xi. Many of the folks in China are there, you know, trying to do their best, but under the auspices of this communist government that is pursuing these aggressive policies. I don't think strategic ambiguity gets us anywhere because that policy through years was thought to bring the Chinese along in a benign way. And we've seen the Chinese have no intention to do that. So strategic ambiguity, I think, is not the policy going forward. I think you have to take on the Chinese head on. And I think the only thing that the Chinese understand is a counter to their aggressive behavior and making sure that they know that they cannot continue this bullying behavior because there will be a consequence of that. Now, listen, we don't want that to escalate into warfare, but if necessary, we will defend. But the key is to be able to deter. Deterrence is job one. The way you deter, I believe, China is not through a policy of strategic ambiguity, but through a policy of realistic deterrence through all means, whether it's through what we do in the United States to counter what China's doing here, what we do economically, what we do strategically. Those are the elements that will work. Those are the things that will stop or counter Chinese efforts. Strategic ambiguity will not deter the Chinese.
Okay, Yuki?
Yes, I do have a quick follow-up that I wanted to do with you, Congressman Wittman, in regards to the being direct. Now is the moment to be direct to China is very effective. But then also creating the atmosphere of support for Taiwan is also effective. And I just wanted to get your thought on, I know U.S. and Taiwan and Japan and Taiwan has a two-way, you know, bilateral, very robust congressional parliamentary exchange. And what is your thought about perhaps expanding it to U.S. Japan, Taiwan? That will be a very powerful picture that can be broadcasted to the world. So just wanted to get your thought on that real quick.
Well, listen, I think that triumvirate of Japan, Taiwan, the United States would hold a tremendous amount of influence in the region. I think the Congress can do even more. I know that Speaker McCarthy is intending to visit. He made a promise that he would visit Taiwan. It'll be one of his early visits in his tenure as Speaker. I think growing that relationship between the Japanese Diet, between the U.S. Congress, and between the governing bodies there in Taiwan are going to be critical. That also enhances the ability for policies and ultimately the adoption of laws by all three countries to be in unison with a focus on deterring China.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, Randy, it was really intriguing about your perspective from your Taiwan visit, that how Taiwan faces a challenge every day. Japan is kind of more or less on the same page. And then I think in a maritime realm, I think both Japanese and Taiwanese Coast Guard really brought that face of the challenge. So what's your thought on the perhaps working more facilitating or creating an enabling environment for U.S. Japan, Taiwanese Coast Guard to work together on a various realm on this issue?
I think it's a great proposal, particularly when it comes to the maritime domain awareness challenges. When you look at the Ryukyu Island chain and Miyako Strait and how close it is to the northern part of Taiwan and the major port of Geelong, it makes all the sense in the world that we'd try to share a common operating picture, and that can be done. Further steps beyond that, coordinating responses as the Chinese do provocative things like military transits through the Miyako Strait, being able to trade off in terms of who shadows or interrogates. I think this is an area that is really quite promising, and also, for those that say it would be provocative in and of itself to have that kind of trilateral cooperation, I would say it's really the Chinese that are driving us all to this point. And their fundamental rejection of a peaceful approach to resolving the Taiwan issue is forcing our hand.
Thank you. I think this may be our last question, combining two questions together from Kendall Walker from Georgetown University and Peter Van Wingerden from Claremont McKenna College. There's definitely a consensus in the DC circle that CCP is a national security threat. And what are some ways? Let me stop there. In your opinion, what are some ways to inspire the interest and increase awareness of the Indo-Pacific security issues among younger generation and the American public at large? We can start with Congressman Wittman, and then we'll go down the panelist.
Well, listen, I think it's going to be a challenge, and the perfect example is TikTok, and looking at how the younger generation absolutely loves TikTok. My granddaughter does, and I tell her and her mother all the time about some of the impacts of TikTok, and they assure me, well, we're limiting it. I said, well, even though you may limit it, believe me, what's going on with data there is not limiting. So the Chinese are very, very, very thoughtful and very creative in how they are able to penetrate different areas of the United States and how they're able to gather data. And I think the younger generation understands now more than ever that I think one of the most important commodities in the future won't necessarily be currency. It will be data. That whoever controls the data and is able to manipulate the data will be the predominant force in the world. So I think younger generations beginning to understand that, and when they understand all the different attributes of what they have at their disposal in technology, but also the vulnerabilities that technology provides, not only to them but to the nation, I think you'll see the younger generation understanding that. Although there is an addiction that occurs with things like TikTok and others that's hard for the younger generation to overcome, because they've been raised in this digital age where social media is part of how they exist. And the Chinese have figured that out and look at these platforms and saying, we know how we're going to get into the younger generation and how we'll get our inroads there and be able to gather data and then have influence. So it's not just gathering data, but it's how do you have influence there too? So, we're going to have to make sure that we do our job to educate the younger generation. And I think they're thoughtful enough to understand what the long-term impact of this will be.
Any thoughts to add from Yuki or Randy on this?
Well, we probably have 20 seconds, but as a Gen Xer, I wouldn't want to be too presumptuous on young people's views. But according to the polls, the things they care about, climate change, women's rights, women may hold up half the sky in China, but they hold up none of the Politburo Standing Committee. I think China challenges should be of most concern to the youngest generation because it's really their future.
Thank you so much. Congressman Wittman, thank you for joining us. Yuki, thanks for joining us. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that you'll tune into our future webinars. Have a great day.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, John. Thanks, Yuki.
Sure. Great job.